Okay. Hello, everyone. Very briefly, I want to introduce myself and get right into this because I feel like I have a lot to say and I don't know where to begin. So, my name is Joy. I am a first generation Canadian with Lebanese heritage. Currently, I'm living in Lebanon. I've been here for 3.5 years pursuing my master's in public policy and international affairs and working in psychosocial support and development. So, to be honest, this is probably the third time I'm recording this because every time I try recording this lecture, I end up going on a rant about the explosion and how there's still no investigation about the explosion, and how when we walk on the street in Beirut, glass is still getting stuck on the bottom of our shoes, and it's quite annoying and quite frustrating to see that it's starting to rain and get cold here, and there's neighbors who don't have windows still. So I'm gonna do my best not to go in that direction. I truthfully make no promises and also apologize in advance if I do go in that direction, but I hope maybe starting my 15-minute talk by sharing those complaints may keep me away from repeating those complaints later on in the talk. But if anyone is interested in knowing a little more about that, of course, feel free to ask those questions at the end. They're not considered off topic to me at all, because actually what I really want to focus this talk on is contextualizing the legitimacy of the threat of COVID-19 in Lebanon, and specifically in Beirut, but in Lebanon, in relation to every other disaster that's been happening here since March, so since COVID-19 entered Lebanon, but as well previous to the entrance of COVID-19 in Lebanon. So just to give you a little overview of what Lebanon has looked like in the past year. In the past year, the Lebanese population has undergone a nationwide revolutionary movement against an oppressive political elite. This movement actually began October 17, 2019. We've also had an economic crisis that has reduced the value of the Lebanese lira by 85% and still continues to decrease in value. The country has also sustained an environmental decline with continued waste mismanagement and countless wildfires that are oftentimes handled or managed by community members living in the community that is on fire, rather than by any form of state intervention. The result of these calamities, and many more that I'm just not going to mention, has not only induced the emergence of famine within Lebanon, but has brought forth a wave of mass migration of Lebanese youth and recent graduates who just hope to escape the continued deteriorating living conditions in Lebanon. So very often I actually get asked, what in the world are you doing here as a recent graduate when there's so many more opportunities outside of Lebanon for you? And I always thrive when I get asked this question, because I truly believe that if we're able to be here and work here and develop on this region, we truthfully should. So, back to topic. In addition to all these political and social and economic and environmental upheavals in Lebanon in the past year, then exists the global public health crisis of COVID-19. As I mentioned earlier, COVID-19 entered Lebanon in March 2020, and it's actually quite interesting to think about it, but when COVID-19 first came to Lebanon in March, the government reacted immediately, locking down the country, including the airports, and was actually sarcastically famed in the Western communities for being an example to look up to, despite the fact that the policies they had implemented here were quite unjust in the way that they were, we can say, implemented. So, for example, we were required, of course, to wear masks and to social distance, but the army patrolling the street or the police patrolling the street were not necessarily wearing masks, and also were not social distancing. In addition, parties, of course, social gatherings of any sort, weddings, were all canceled for the summer. But the 1% connected to government were still entitled to throwing these types of soirees and not getting any type of, let's just say, ticket. No tickets for them. So it's been quite interesting to see how COVID-19 has successfully continued to disenfranchise already vulnerable populations that have been extremely, extremely hit by the economic crisis and the revolution and the environmental catastrophes that we had here in Lebanon. Come the explosion on August 4th, you only see an increase in those types of difficulties. So people that had already been suffering are now suffering way, way more, an unimaginable amount. And those that were not suffering before have now begun to suffer. Many may know this, but Beirut is actually the capital of Lebanon, so it's considered one of the wealthiest cities in the country. And to see the 1% who mostly live here in the city also suffer is actually quite an interesting dynamic, but very off topic. So what I really want to do is contextualize the threat of COVID-19 to post-explosion Beirut by exploring two major questions. The first question is, has the emergence of recent policies, such as the state of emergency and social distancing requirements that I just mentioned, been effective in securing the well-being and safety of Beirutis? And I ask this question in relation to concerns related to COVID-19, but more so in the context of the population's overall well-being post-explosion. And the second question I really want to explore is, in what ways have marginalized and vulnerable communities been considered or further disenfranchised in the implementation of COVID-19 related policies? So before really getting into this, I think I just want to mention that in no way am I saying COVID-19 is not a legitimate threat. COVID-19 very much is a very legitimate threat, especially here in Lebanon. But the reality is there are other more immediate threats here that I think community members and individuals prioritize when thinking about their safety and their well-being, and especially since the blast. So the way I want to break up this presentation is essentially by looking at three different communities or three different generations, taking a small peek at youth, looking at refugees and migrant workers, and then taking a look at the elders in Beirut to see kind of how each community or each generation, let's say, really comes to terms with the COVID-19 prevention policies, how they adapt them to themselves, and how it has either hindered or supported their reconstruction of Beirut. And when I say reconstruction, I don't just mean the legitimate rebuilding of the city, but I also mean the emotional and mental energy put into rebuilding themselves, because it is quite heavy here in Beirut to see the general atmosphere of the population. So maybe we can start very briefly by talking about the youth. I think when it comes to youth, I have the most to say about them, which is why I just want to quickly get it out. Youth groups here in Lebanon, since the October 17th revolution, but even previous, have consistently tried to combat the political class here in Lebanon by either creating parallel systems to the systems that exist through the state, or by publicly and shamelessly holding them accountable for either the mismanagement of public resources, public funds, but also their inability to implement social welfare programs that have been very, very much needed in the past year. So when the explosion took place on the 4th, 6 days following, the government was nowhere to be seen. Only on the 6th day did the government actually come out of whatever shell they were hiding in to say to the people that they were implementing a state of emergency whereby essentially military control would take over the country and no freedoms at all were legally allowed to be expressed. So freedom of expression, freedom of assembly completely blocked. And this, in essence, really, really made developing and working on crisis relief after the blast quite difficult for the communities who were spearheading the crisis relief, basically. I know I said this, but yes. So basically, it's interesting to see when the government had first implemented lockdown measures, social distancing measures in March, youth groups were very enthused to support the government, sort of putting aside the fight that we've been putting up since October 17th against them, and instead collaborating with them to make sure that, yes, social distancing is implemented, mask wearing is implemented, the communities here are being safe and conscious of how COVID-19 spreads. But that type of enthusiasm very quickly shifted throughout the summer, and then upon the blast just completely evaporated. So you see after the blast, looking after, or not looking after, but implementing COVID-19 prevention measures was still promoted and still encouraged, but most truthfully it was done so for the sake of not angering any international contributions or international support to relief aid in Lebanon. So wearing masks, check, but social distancing, X, because how are you supposed to social distance when 300,000 of the city's population is displaced because their homes are gone and they're all rebuilding together? Not to mention, just in truth, the necessity of being near loved ones, being near your friends, checking on your community members, checking on, your fruit man and your meat man or woman, and really reconnecting to the people that are still there and checking on them was very, very important after August 4th. And social distancing no longer was priority because many people here felt like, okay, they were so close to death already. And so the idea was focusing on rebuilding, top priority, wearing masks, and sticking to prevention methods that still allow aid workers to continue developing and delivering aid, was sort of the path that people took. And I know I'm being very broad here, but I'm at 13 minutes. So I'm definitely going to include more of this in the paper and case examples as well. And feel free to actually ask me questions and I'll answer them. But maybe from here we can shift to 1 minute talk about the elders in the community. So in contrast to the youth who are very active, very on the street, very let's wear the mask, let's protect the communities and continue educating them, but still do aid work, the elders take the approach of completely ignoring the existence of COVID-19 in the country. So if we really look at the timeline of many of the elders here, they have experienced a 15-year civil war. They have experienced not one economic collapse, but two. They have experienced the 2006 war with Israel. And I think most importantly, they watched the reconstruction and deconstruction of Lebanon after the civil war and now with this explosion. And I think many of them do not care for COVID, not because they do not care for COVID, but because they've outlived so many disasters. And to them, again, community development is so much more important. And what's beautiful, especially when I'm out on the street myself, is seeing the elders come and, sweep the street or support in food delivery or help cook, help with resource allocation. And it's quite beautiful to see that it's not just the youth that are doing development work right now, it's everyone. but the fears or the threat of COVID are completely not a concern for the elders here, at least not the elders that have been impacted by the blast, so the elders that I'm looking at. Very briefly, 1 minute on refugees and migrants. I think the most important thing I want to say or heavily highlight is that they were disenfranchised and disrespected previous to 2020, previous to 2019, previous to 2018. Refugees and migrant workers here are often blamed for any downfall that happens, and they are oftentimes treated like objects or, sadly, literally like slaves. Completely inhumane and incorrect. And this is not something that changed after the blast. If anything, this is probably something that got worse. Many migrant workers actually were thrown out or ditched, left in front of the embassies of their countries to be sent back to their countries because the owners of the migrant workers no longer have the funds to pay for them or simply no longer want them with what happened with the blast. In addition to this, refugees have always been seen as outcasts and have never been treated like, belonging to Lebanon. So when the government finally decided to deliver aid, food boxes, actually it was, I think, about 8 days after the blast, they intentionally excluded refugees and migrant workers from receiving aid by enforcing all recipients of the aid to show their Lebanese ID before receiving the food boxes. So this actually stirred a large commotion and is part of the reason why a large campaign came out after the blast about not giving international NGOs to not give aid to the government because the government was not delivering in an ethical and honest manner, and rather they were delivering based off of racism, sectarianism. So it's quite sad to see that for refugees and migrant workers, whenever I'd speak to them on the topic of COVID-19, it's just an added strain. It's not the strain in itself. The strain in itself is that they already never had, large spaces for social distancing. Oftentimes, refugees and migrant workers live in small spaces. So how do people that live in small spaces with many people who work in many different places expect to social distance themselves? It's not possible. Also, their access to their funds are extremely limited. So if ever they do get COVID, care for COVID and even doing COVID testing may not be an option for them because they simply do not have the funds to supplement those types of resources. So it's a little, it's difficult, and I know I kind of covered a lot and nothing at all at the same time because there's so much to say on each topic, and it might have been a better presentation actually if I isolated it into just looking at refugees or just looking at youth or just looking at elders. But I think what I really just wanted to showcase is how everything here is up in the air, and despite the policies taken by the state to prevent COVID-19 increase in the country, the reality is the population, regardless of whether it's youth activists or refugees and migrant workers or elders, no one here really has faith in the government to protect them, to secure their well-being. And so a large part of COVID-19 prevention relies on groups within communities that enforce and educate COVID-19 prevention tactics on the community itself. Less so oriented around the state, more so oriented around the population and their own enthusiasm and incentive to oblige to COVID-19 prevention methods. I think I want to stop because I'm actually at 19 minutes, but very quickly I want to say thank you, and please do reach out if you have any questions at all, because I know this was very broad of a presentation and I may not have covered that much, but I look forward to hear your questions and I hope I can answer them. All right, cool. Cool. Bye, everyone.